National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan there speaking at the press briefing. Let's quickly listen in.
Stabilize their country and determine their future. Now, turning to today's events, as you all know, President Biden looks forward to welcoming President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk of Poland for a joint meeting at the White House this afternoon. President Biden has twice traveled to Warsaw for historic visits in 2022 and 2023, and today he has the opportunity to repay the hospitality of the Polish people and the leaders of Poland. The leaders will celebrate the 25th anniversary of Poland joining the NATO alliance, which is more united, determined, dynamic, and larger than ever, now 32 nations strong after Sweden joined the alliance last week. This afternoon, the leaders will reaffirm their ironclad commitment to the NATO alliance and to our collective self-defense under Article 5. And they will coordinate in advance of the upcoming NATO summit, which will be hosted by President Biden here in Washington this summer. They will also discuss our shared support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's brutal war of aggression. As you know, Poland has provided significant security assistance to Ukraine. It's also played a critical support and logistics role for the U.S. and our allies and partners in a historic and unprecedented effort to supply Ukraine with the tools that it needs to defend Ukraine against this Russian imperial war of conquest. The Polish people have also generously opened their doors to about 1 million Ukrainian refugees. Poland's leadership has also demonstrated that, once again, in a very live and almost technicolor way, that Putin's illegal invasion has produced the exact opposite effect of what Putin intended. Today, Poland is spending nearly 4% of its GDP on defense, double the NATO commitment, and is serving as an anchor in a vibrant, vital alliance just when Putin thought he would divide and weaken the NATO alliance. Our bilateral relationship is also growing even stronger. Today, the President will share with Poland's leaders that the United States plans to move forward with a new $2 billion foreign military financing direct loan to Poland using previously appropriated congressional funds, and will offer to sell Poland 96 Apache helicopters. These and other initiatives will equip Poland with cutting-edge capability to defend itself while also strengthening NATO interoperability and contributing to American jobs. The leaders will also discuss the strong U.S.-Polish energy security partnership, the robust economic relationship between our countries, and the enduring importance of democratic values. I also want to provide an update about Ukraine. For 2 years, with the support of a coalition of more than 50 partners led by the United States, the people of Ukraine have remained unflinching against an adversary bent on their destruction. They've retaken more than half the territory that Russia occupied at the start of the conflict. They've repulsed Russia's attempts to take large swaths of Ukrainian territory, now 2 winters in a row. They've severely degraded Russia's Black Sea fleet, but they need our continued support, and they need it urgently. Ukrainian troops have fought bravely, are fighting bravely throughout this war, but they are now forced to ration their ammunition under pressure on multiple fronts. And we're already seeing the effects on the battlefield. When Russian troops advance and its guns fire, Ukraine does not have enough ammunition to fire back. That's costing terrain, it's costing lives, and it's costing us, the United States and the NATO alliance, strategically. So today, on behalf of President Biden, I'm announcing an emergency package of security assistance of $300 million worth of weapons and equipment to address some of Ukraine's pressing needs. This is possible because of unanticipated cost savings in contracts that DoD negotiated to replace equipment we've already sent to Ukraine through previous drawdowns. When we sent Ukraine weapons last year, we negotiated contracts to replenish those weapons in U.S. stockpiles. We budgeted the full amount of appropriated funds for those contracts. It turns out we negotiated well. Those contracts came in under budget. So we have a modest amount of funding available. And to put a fine point on it, we're able to use these cost savings to make this modest amount of new security assistance available right now without impacting U.S. military readiness. And the President has directed his team to use these cost savings. This emergency package that we're announcing contains a large tranche of artillery rounds and gimlers for the HIMARS. It is assistance that Ukraine desperately needs to hold the line against Russian attacks, and to push back against the continuing Russian onslaught in the east and in other parts of Ukraine. This ammunition will keep Ukraine's guns firing for a period, but only a short period. It is nowhere near enough to meet Ukraine's battlefield needs, and it will not prevent Ukraine from running out of ammunition in the weeks to come. It goes without saying, this package does not displace and should not delay the critical need to pass the bipartisan national security bill. As you all know, we've said repeatedly here in the briefing room, and President Biden said it to the entire nation in the State of the Union last week, that we cannot provide ongoing assistance to Ukraine without significantly impacting our military readiness, absent congressional action. That remains the case despite this modest amount of cost savings that we are putting to use on an urgent basis. Congress must act. The House of Representatives must pass the bipartisan national security supplemental as soon as possible. We all know that if it came up for a vote, it would pass on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, just as it did in the Senate. And there is no other way around this. The House has got to pass the supplemental as soon as possible to allow us to continue the flow of vital security assistance to Ukraine, to replenish the U.S. military's munition stocks, to invest in our industrial base, and to support jobs in 40 states across the United States. The world is watching. The clock is ticking, and we need to see action as rapidly as possible, even as we do everything in our power to get Ukraine what it needs in its hour of need. And that is another step that we took at the President's direction today. With that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Yeah. First, on Israel, if Israel moves forward with the Rafah operation, without having contingencies in place to ensure what you guys believe is adequate safety for civilians, would the White House send any sort of conditionality on further aid?
So I've read these reports. They're based on uninformed speculation by anonymous officials. I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals. The President has been very clear about our position on Rafah, and our position is that a military operation in Rafah that does not protect civilians, that cuts off the main arteries of humanitarian assistance, and that places enormous pressure on the Israel-Egypt border is not something that he can support. We are talking to the Israelis about that. We are working through it, and I'm not going to stand at this podium and entertain hypotheticals on it. Yeah.
Just on that question, on that issue, the President did say over the weekend that if Israel forces were to go into Rafah, that would be a crossing of a red line. I'm just wondering, what would the Biden administration do if that did come to fruition and Israeli forces did go into Rafah?
I would just note, having been around a little while, that I know all of you are obsessed with this concept of the red line. The President didn't make any declarations or pronouncements or announcements. The red line came up in a question. He was responding to that question. I think he gave a full answer to it. I think it's worth going back and reading his full answer to that question. And he answered it completely, so I've got nothing to add to what he said. And again, as I said to the earlier question, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. We've made clear our concerns about an operation in Rafah. We've made clear our concerns about the fact that an operation would put an enormous number of civilians at risk, and we have not seen a credible plan to protect them.
All right, I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center here in New York, and you're watching a breaking news development unfolding right now. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan there at the White House just announced that President Biden has approved an emergency package of security assistance of some $300 million for the Ukrainian military right now. He says it's equipment the country desperately needs in its fight against Russia. He mentioned that the Ukrainian military has had to ration their ammunition and that it's running out. He says this $300 million emergency package is nowhere near enough, but it will help Ukraine now continue its fight and defend democratic values, in his words. That's the breaking story at the moment. We want to listen more now as he speaks about other major topics, including U.S. support of Israel and its conflict with Hamas. Let's listen.
Policy, on his concern about the protection of civilians, and about Israel being able to sustain a campaign in a way that ultimately leads to an outcome in which the people of Israel are secure, Hamas is crushed, and there is a long-term solution to stability and peace in the region. He believes there is a path to do that, and that path does not lie in smashing into Rafah, where there are 1.3 million people, in the absence of a credible plan to deal with the population there. And again, as things stand today, we have not seen what that plan is. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. On Poland, you mentioned energy conversation. Do you expect that the U.S. will make progress or even maybe secure the second nuclear plant contract during these talks? And the president yesterday said that he didn't believe that additional additional U.S. troops were needed in Poland. That was a request that the Poles were bringing to this meeting. Could you talk through why he doesn't believe that that's necessary, considering the sort of geopolitical climate?
Well, just to take a step back and look at the incredible array of assets the United States currently has deployed in Poland, including a permanent combat headquarters, including elements of brigades, including the largest complement of U.S. forces on the ground in Poland at any time. And that's in response to exactly that elevated threat that we see on the basis of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its bellicose statements about NATO allies, including Poland. So we are looking at an enhanced, effective U.S. presence and a broader NATO presence in Poland and in the countries neighboring Poland. And at any time the president determines that additional capabilities are needed anywhere across the alliance, he's determined he's demonstrated the capacity to flow forces rapidly, as we did in the days leading up to the invasion, and that could be land, air, or sea. So the president looks forward to the conversation with the president and the prime minister today. He believes that we are postured well, that our deterrence and defense capacity, both in terms of boots on the ground and in terms of the plans that we have in place to defend Poland should it come to that, are strong. And he has also sent a very clear message, which he is backing up with our force posture, that every inch of NATO territory will be protected. With respect to the question of additional nuclear plants, we've had very constructive conversations with Polish counterparts. I don't have anything to announce from the podium today, but we do look to an ongoing deepening and broadening civil nuclear cooperation with Poland.
And very quickly on TikTok, the president said yesterday that he would sign the House bill if it passed. Earlier, you guys had said you were broadly supportive but had some concerns. Can you outline what those concerns are, and are you confident that the House bill, which seems like it's teeing up for a vote, would stand up in court and be able to force the sale of TikTok?
Well, first, I just want to be clear about what this bill is all about, because a lot of people are going around throwing around the words ban TikTok, TikTok ban. And the ultimate object of the bill is about a question of ownership. Do we want TikTok as a platform to be owned by an American company or owned by China? Do we want the data from TikTok, children's data, adults' data, to be staying here in America or going to China? That is the fundamental question at issue here, and the president is clear where he stands on that fundamental issue. Then in terms of how that gets implemented precisely, that's something that we have continued to stay in touch with the Congress on. And obviously, as you've seen, there's been an overwhelming bipartisan vote in the committee. Now it will come to the floor, and we'll see what happens in the House, and I'm not going to get ahead of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. So in response to what the president said about the red line, Prime Minister Netanyahu, he ultimately sounded like he vowed to defy what the president said. He said he would press ahead with an invasion of Rafah. So is the president losing influence with Netanyahu?
Well, let's just take a step back. You've got the president who, from the very first day that this crisis began, and let's remember, it began with a horrific, vicious, brutal assault by Hamas on the people of Israel, killing 1,200 people, raping and pillaging and causing the most death since the Holocaust for the Jewish people. And the president stood up and said Israel would never be alone. He went as the first ever American president in wartime to Israel to say, I have Israel's back, and he has had Israel's back. He has backed up those words with deeds all the way through, and not just in terms of providing for Israel's security against Hamas and Hezbollah, but a broader constellation of steps in terms of military deterrence to keep this war from spinning out in ways that Israel could not handle. So that's where the president comes into this. He also is going to speak out when he has concerns about the level of protection for innocent civilians in Gaza, the level and access to humanitarian assistance for innocent civilians in Gaza, and he's going to make his views known. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu is the leader of a sovereign country. He can make determinations about what he's going to do, and let's actually see what happens. At the end of the day, the president has laid out his views about Rafah. He's been clear about them. And that's not just true publicly, but privately we've communicated with the Israeli government on this. We intend to continue to communicate directly with the Israeli government at every level, including between the president and the prime minister, and we will see where things go from here. So we believe that the president has the capacity to engage his Israeli counterparts in an effective way, and Rafah is one element of that. There are other elements as well. And so far, from our perspective, the real issue is what happens on the ground, not so much what happens in the back and forth of words.
Communicated in the public sphere.
All right, we've been listening to White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan giving us a number of headlines and updates there from the Brady press briefing room. He's mentioning that President Biden, he says, doesn't really have a red line when it comes to negotiations with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his efforts to go into Rafah in the West Bank. He's speaking more about a larger picture about not allowing the ongoing war to destabilize. He mentioned that there is an effort to rule on TikTok and if it should be banned in some way in the United States. But we want to speak more about the major headline the Biden administration announced, which was a roughly $300 million emergency security package for Ukraine. Now, Mr. Sullivan said the savings will be used to help provide additional weapons to the war-torn country. President Biden has been pushing Congress to pass a fresh new aid package, but House Republican Speaker Mike Johnson has refused to bring that to the floor for a vote. Let's bring in CBS News Pentagon reporter and producer Eleanor Watson for more on what is described as a drawdown. Ellie, help us understand where this money comes from, this $300 million, and how it is expected to work to help the Ukrainian military.
Well, this is the first drawdown of equipment for Ukraine since December. Drawdowns are when the Defense Department takes weapons off of Pentagon shelves and ships them to Ukraine. But this $300 million is relatively small compared to what the U.S. was giving in the first 2 years of the invasion. The Pentagon was able to shake loose some money for Ukraine, but officials today have called it a one-time shot, an emergency fund. This is not sustainable. Until Congress passes more funding for Ukraine, all this package will really do is buy Ukraine a little bit more time.
Yeah, we heard Jake Sullivan there say that the Ukrainian military is having to ration ammunition as it continues to push back the Russian invasion. Help us understand this drawdown and assets on the shelf that the U.S. will now move into Ukraine. What does it include?
Well, we heard today from Jake Sullivan that it's expected to include artillery and Gimlers for those rocket systems Ukraine has been using to strike deeper into the Russian-occupied territory. Now, we heard from Sullivan today and for officials for really weeks that the Ukrainians have had to ration their ammunition. There really is just not enough supply to meet the Ukraine's demands. Last month, they had to withdraw from Avdiivka, the first major Russian victory in a while, in large part because of the lack of ammunition. Now, Sullivan today, though, said this package is not going to stop the depleting supply of ammunition. It's really just a stopgap for a few weeks.
Yeah, and to help viewers understand those Gimlers are for the HIMARS. Those are the high-mobility artillery rocket systems that allow the Ukrainian forces to launch at a distance to the Russian forces. But we also heard Jake Sullivan say that still the administration needs the bipartisan national security supplemental to be passed by Congress. It's already passed the Senate. It's $95 billion. In what ways would that help the U.S. efforts to not just help Ukraine, but Israel and conflicts in the Middle East also?
Right. So that supplemental, which the Biden administration put forward in October, includes funding for Ukraine, funding for Israel, and funding for the Middle East in the CENTCOM area, where we've seen those attacks in the Red Sea and on troops in Iraq and Syria. So the drawdown today is probably some welcome news to Ukrainians, but there's still a lot more in that supplemental that the administration is really trying to push through.
All right, Eleanor Watson for us at the Pentagon with this headline that the Biden administration announces $300 million on what's described as a drawdown for Ukrainian forces. Ellie, thank you.